Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brown is the New White. So we're going to do a conversation here with 18 Million Rising. My name is Taz. I'm the campaign strategist here at 18 Million Rising. We're going to be having a conversation over the next about hour about this wonderful book written by Steve Phillips called Brown is the New White. And we have a few speakers with us as well. Before we get started, I wanted to thank our co-sponsors. We have 18 Million Rising and PowerPack, who are co-sponsoring this conversation right now. And if you do want to follow along with the conversation, please use the hashtag Brown is the New White. You can have the conversation be tweeting at us. You can also be, if you're in the group chat, you can go into the chat function and then ask your questions there, and we'll be able to follow up with your questions near the end of the program. So before we jump on, before we move further, I wanted to introduce our panelists. We're very excited to have them today. We have, one second. I'll start with Stephanie. We have Stephanie. Stephanie Chang is Michigan State Representative for House District 6, which includes River Rouge, Ecorse, and part of Detroit. She worked as an organizer for around a decade in Detroit on social justice issues before running for office, and was the first Asian American woman in the Michigan legislature. Next we have Monica Dennis. Monica Dennis is the New York City Regional Coordinator for Black Lives Matter, an international organizing network focused on combating anti-Black racism in all of its forms. She's a trainer and coach who uses practices from the African diasporic tradition to help organizations with commitments to racial justice and equity. And she is coming in to us from Johannesburg right now. Next we have Karthick Ramakrishnan. He's a professor of political science and public policy at UC Riverside, where he is also Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy. He's also the director of AAPIData.com, which seeks to make policy-relevant data about Asian American and Pacific Islander communities more accessible for policymakers. And finally, we have Steve Phillips, who is the writer of the book, Brown is the New White. Steve Phillips is a national political leader, civil rights lawyer, and senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. His new book, Brown is the New White, explores the history and future of a new electoral strategy focusing not on so-called swing voters, but on turning out the new American majority, people of color and progressive whites. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And before I get started on talking about the book, I wanted to kind of touch upon some of the themes of the book. I had a chance to look it over. Was very excited to hear a lot of the ideas that Steve mentioned in his book were a lot of the things that we as a community of color have been talking about the electoral movement for the past 10, 15 years. It's really interesting because Stephanie and I worked in the 2004 campaign way back in the day, so it's kind of a big, fun, full circle to see all of these speakers here today. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is that 18 Million Rising works in digital organizing for the Asian American community. And one of the things that we have been grappling with in the Asian American movement when it comes to voter engagement work is just how much our voices and our votes are marginalized in this community. Because most of the population in the Asian American community live in California or New York, one of these larger states, which aren't swing states, these mainstream progressive white organizers and movements tend to ignore creating tools and resources to get out the Asian American vote. And I think this is one of the themes that Steve talks about in his book. And because our Asian American movement is being ignored, these resources aren't being created, you do see that there's a large percentage of Asian American voters who align themselves independent because none of the parties are trying to get this community of voters on their side. One of the most interesting things that's come out in the census, and I think Karthick might be talking about this later, is just how fast the Asian American community is growing and just how fast the Asian American electorate has the potential of growing, and how important it will be for this movement to not just get out and vote, but to have these mainstream resources, mainstream communities try to get our vote. So I wanted to frame the conversation around that because of who 18 Million Rising is. And I think to kick us off, I'm going to ask all of our panelists, why is it important to have this book in this moment? I think maybe before I go into the panelists, maybe Steve, you can start us off and talk a little bit about what this book is and why you wrote this book, and then we'll go into the panelists, other panelists.
Great. Thanks, Tess. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I'm really excited to do this. I've been watching the growth of 18 Million Rising over the past several years, and I'm really delighted to see there being this kind of infrastructure and network being put together in the Asian American community. I mean, I recall when Move On was founded originally, and it's been great to see the other organizations really assert their voice within the larger political and social change space. Just a quick thing about the book. I mean, I really very consciously wanted to write the book as a tool for activists and people doing work around social change in the context of the country's changing demographics. And that one of the things that's been very frustrating to me is to be part of different campaigns and movements where people don't understand the significance, really even just mathematically, of the country's growing communities of color. And they continue to both run an ineffective political strategy of chasing the shrinking sector of the electorate, that's the more conservative white swing voters. I have a chapter in the book called Requiem for the White Swing Voter. But more importantly, that results in moderating one's politics and beliefs. So we don't actually have a strong, unapologetic social justice voice because you feel that you're not going to be able to get majority support. So what we were able to do in the book is really make the argument and show how since 1965, when the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed, the country's population has changed so dramatically that people of color used to be 12% of the U.S. population, and now they're 38%, and continuing to grow at a very dramatic sense. I talk about getting larger every day. So progressive people of color and progressive whites are actually 51% of all eligible voters in the country. We break that down looking at census data and exit poll data, and really affirmed through the example of Obama's election and re-election fundamentally. And so we have this demographic power, and which is translated into social change power, into electoral power, if we will build on it, and if we will embrace it and acknowledge it. And the reason that I wrote the book was I'm very alarmed, frankly, that too many people in leadership of progressive campaigns don't appreciate this, and they continue to discount and marginalize the communities of color. I was in a meeting once with a top California political operative who has responsible for multi-million-dollar responsibilities of running a campaign. It was asked, what about the Latino vote? And he says, well, Latino vote is so important, but it's not really the most important thing. What's most important is women, as he was putting it. Well, first of all, which women? There's a whole question around that, right? But so the Latinos are only 14% of the vote. First of all, he was wrong mathematically. They were 22% of the vote. And yet these are the people who are responsible for spending tens of millions of dollars in a state like California, and really hundreds of millions of dollars nationally. But those people who are on the ground trying to do the activist work, trying to bring attention to the significance of the power and the potential of communities of color, really haven't had the arguments, haven't had the data. They have the argument, they haven't had the data and the evidence to be able to say, no, if you want to win, you have to embrace communities of color. And that, frankly, in terms of the, I think it's the lesson of the past 8 years that when people of color have turned out, that they've had a significant impact, and when they have not turned out, the conservative forces have had more influence. So that's really what I wanted to try to do, was to provide both a quantitative and a qualitative tool that really has a lot of the evidence, the numbers, the spreadsheets around showing that the progressive people of color are the cornerstones of a new electoral majority, and in partnership with progressive whites who have consistently been, there is a meaningful minority of whites who have been supportive of people of color. That's the majority of people. And we need to be investing heavily in that grouping if we're going to actually be able to move forward in building what we're calling the new American majority. And so that's the context and the purpose of it, and I'm really delighted to have this conversation and partnership, because I wanted to provide this as a tool and a resource for those who are fighting these fights at the local level and in the state level, to be able to, force, I kind of saying, help and harass campaigns to do what we need to do to build a new progressive majority.
Great, thank you for that, Steve. Before I wanted to just ask a quick follow-up. Do you think people are listening? I know your book's been out for about a week. Do you think that the people that you wanted to pay attention to the book are listening to the amazing information you have in it?
Well, it's interesting. What's been very encouraging is that it's resonating and it's landing with those we hoped it would. And so there was a minister in Louisiana who called and was very excited and says, I've been making these arguments for years, but we haven't had the data. And that your book provides the data. So then he's able to go back to the campaigns and actually engage in this struggle. So at that level, in fact, we're getting that kind of response all over the country, that people are feeling validated. We really want, Chapter 2 really goes through some level of qualitative and quantitative information, exploration of each of the groupings of color as well as progressive whites, and really tried to validate and those have some cultural authenticity to it, and so that response has been very warm and responsive and exciting. So I'm really pleased about that. We have not yet had the very top levels of people say, "Oh, we've got it all wrong. Can you come tell us how to function?" So I'm waiting on that call.
Yeah, I'm excited when that happens.
Right.
I'm going to throw it to Karthick. Karthick, why do you think this book is important at this moment, and how do you see it playing out in the work that you do? And especially with you, because you do so much work in the number crunching and doing data for the Asian American community. How do you see that interplaying with a lot of the thesis that Steve has in his narrative?
Well, thank you for having me, and hopefully I just experienced a bit of a technical glitch before, so hopefully that's not going to be an issue when I'm talking. No, this is exciting to see, and the work that we do is very much in line with this. When you don't have the data, when you don't have the evidence, the kind of arguments that people make are just seen as rhetoric, right? That they want to see the evidence. Like Steve says, with the kind of example that he pointed out. This isn't always the case with other communities. Other times people just make things up and it's just treated as received wisdom. So I think we need to also just think about privilege and how that works. Certain communities need to prove themselves more than others. But that said, it's powerful to bring this kind of data, this kind of evidence to bear. A lot of times one is to show the numbers. But I think the opinion side is also important because it's not just to show that the numbers of these populations and their voting populations, voting potential, specifically say in presidential elections, and I've seen some, I think it was the Washington Post coverage of the book to talk about the difference between presidential and midterms and how, not being able to successfully bring out the base, right, and especially communities of color can be very consequential. And especially when it comes to progressive politics, can be devastating to progressive politics. So I think it's a very necessary book. It's a very necessary evidence and very timely, right? We've gone now beyond Iowa and New Hampshire. By the way, when you look at Iowa, even though I haven't seen precinct level or specific caucus location specific results, we know that contest on the Democratic side was close enough that communities of color would have made the difference. So even in Iowa, it's diversifying, and you have significant African American, Latino, and AAPI communities that are getting out there and making their voices heard. But the investments need to happen, and importantly, people need to pay attention to the evidence. I can't tell you how many times people still have this stereotype in their head, probably from the 80s and 90s when there wasn't good polling data, but they just went by maybe voter registration data to say, well, Asian Americans are a third Republican, third Democrat, and a third independent. Whereas we know that if you look at presidential voting patterns, and many different surveys show this, that there's been a strong partisan shift, and not just on party, but even on issues. So Asian Americans are on the same page as African Americans and Latinos when it comes to things like favoring the Affordable Care Act, or believing in paying higher taxes in order to pay for the social safety net. So we have many issues like this, higher minimum wage. So there's a very strong set of support in AAPI communities and Latino communities and African American communities and progressive whites, right? So it's kind of, I think one knock that someone might say is that, well, this is a racial argument. No, not really. What it's saying is you have important bases of support that are in support of a certain kind of progressive agenda, and we don't need to water down that agenda. But the mobilization is key to enacting an agenda like that.
Great, thank you so much for that. I'm going to throw it to Stephanie. Stephanie, you're doing amazing work out in Michigan. I wanted to ask you the same question. How do you see Steve's thesis playing out in the work that you're doing, especially over in the last 18 months? I mean, I imagine with everything that's going on in Michigan that there's a lot of stuff in play right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you to all of you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm, just really happy to be here. So just a little bit of background. The district that I represent is House District 6 in Michigan, and it's a primarily African-American district but also does include part of Southwest Detroit, which has a large Latino population. And I am Asian American, so it's kind of like just kind of like an interesting experience, I think, when we're talking about, obviously my district is also heavily Democratic, and but I think the same sort of concepts about being, what did you say? We need unapologetic social justice voice. We need that. And also just speaking to issues that resonate with the folks in my community. Definitely rings true for my own election and also for serving as a state rep. So I just had a couple things to say. I mean, I think there was a lot that Steve said that really resonated with me. And I think there's sort of two different sides of this. One is about how for elected officials like me, how we serve and the issues that we choose to work on, and how that relates to folks of color in our communities that either are voting or maybe we need to do more to get them out to vote. And then on the campaign side. So just in terms of actually serving as a state rep, so in Michigan, like in many other states, we have a Republican majority in actually both of our chambers, and we have a Republican governor. I'm a Democrat, and I think that it's been a real, I'm in my first term, so I've been learning a lot very quickly. And one of the things that I think is really clear is that being in the minority, there's sort of competing interests in one wanting to take back the state house this year, which I'm hopeful that we will be able to. But in the way that we do that, on our path to November, what are the issues that we choose to tackle, and what are the ways that we talk about them, especially the issues that primarily affect communities of color. So I think that two issues that will be a really big test of my colleagues, I think, in the coming months are around the Flint water crisis and around Detroit public schools. And I know that both of those issues have gotten some national and maybe international attention. So I think we all know about the lead contamination issues in Flint's water and the levels of, well, whatever we want to call it, whether it be either ignoring or actually manipulating or whatever you want to say about, I think that some of the investigations that are ongoing will sort of uncover what exactly happened. But regardless of all of that, to me and a lot of my colleagues, this comes down to an issue of water should be a human right. And so I think for me, one of the tests here is how do we talk about this, and how do we tackle this issue of the Flint water crisis in Detroit? I don't know if folks remember, but it was only less than 2 years ago that Detroit was getting international headlines for the tens of thousands of water shutoffs. And I think somehow people may have forgotten, but this is actually still happening. People are still getting their water shut off. So whether it be lead contamination or unaffordable water, these are issues that are predominantly affecting communities of color. And I think that myself and a number of my colleagues, we have actually a pretty diverse group, and it's actually a bipartisan group of folks working on this issue. But I think it will be an interesting test to see how my party and also how we as the legislature choose to deal with this issue, because this is something that affects, well, affects everyone, but primarily affects communities of color. So I think it, whether or not as Democrats we're able to show our strength and be unapologetically social justice oriented on this issue, I think might have a direct correlation to who is inspired to come out and actually vote for folks who are candidates for public office. Because if we aren't taking up these issues, and if we're not being strong and leading and inspiring and showing that we really need to address these issues in a bold way, I think that we're missing a huge opportunity. And then around Detroit public schools, I think folks have seen sort of the headlines and the media coverage of the mold and the kids wearing coats in the classroom because the heat isn't on and all of this. There's a lot of issues, and it's a very complicated problem that we're trying to solve, but I think what we're able to do there, again, I think we'll speak to, well, it's an issue that predominantly affects kids of color, and so how are we addressing these issues, I think will again directly translate to whether or not folks feel inspired and connected to us as a political party, speaking as a Democrat. And then on the campaign side, obviously I do think that that folks just on the sort of progressive side of things, as well as the party, as well as the nonpartisan side, everyone just needs to be doing a better job of directly engaging voters of color. Having been involved in starting Asian Pacific Islander American Vote Michigan, and we were really just trying to fill a void because not really anyone was doing nonpartisan voter engagement with the Asian American community. So we decided, well, we should do that. But I think that we all need to do a better job of that. I will say that from the party side, and even from not necessarily the party, but also just community groups also need to do a better job of recruiting candidates of color, because I think that there is something to be said about when you see someone in office, sort of having that level of feeling like, okay, well, that's someone that understands the issues or shares my values or looks like me. I think that also has a really important role in drawing out voters of color as well. And one just final point is that we also, in addition to recruiting candidates of color, also need to do a better job of making sure that we have a pipeline of folks working on campaigns to understand who are people of color, who know how to reach out to voters of color, who know the issues affecting our communities, and so just up and down the line, we need to do a better job. So I think that's it for now.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think a lot of what you were saying really ties into what was said in the book as far as structural supremacy, how that plays in, I mean, just everything with what's happening in Flint. Like that's an amazing case study of how it goes from the politics to grassroots level and what's happening on the ground, and atrocious. Really interested to see how that's going to play out in the next few weeks. Now we are going to turn to Monica Dennis. Thank you so much for coming in to us from around the world. So same question, how do you think the thesis of this book, In Brown is the New White, plays out in the work that you're doing?
Thanks again for having me. Super excited to be part of this conversation. I think this book is so timely. It's exactly what's needed. It helps to address, one, the disillusionment, particularly in Black communities, that we experience around voting and being a fully engaged civic society. And so to have in great detail and a really accessible way what the impact that communities of color make in general, but particularly how the contribution that Black communities are making to the electoral process is just brilliant and genius, and gives us an opportunity to kind of politicize our base, right? And so, and politicize specifically around civic engagement, right? And so what I want to be clear about is that started working in communities where people already have an analysis about their condition, just as Stephanie laid out, and what is actually happening to them, and yet there's a disconnect from their actual ability to impact change or to hold the state accountable, which everyone knows that's really what Black Lives Matter is about how do we, one of the things we're about is about how do we hold the state accountable. And so to have this data and these stories, quite frankly, help us to actually mobilize within our work. And then also I would say that it is, in the way that we've been approaching our movement-based work, that it's been storytelling matched with the actual data, right? And so this supports the actual way in which we're organizing in the Black Lives Matter movement, that people are telling their stories, and hey, there's actually data to back this up. And particularly in the communities where I organize in New York City for the last 20 years has had a Republican administration at the city level. And that's so interesting to think about, given that New York City is a city that has significant, almost majority people of color, and that 40% of those folks in New York City are identify as immigrants along a spectrum of what it means to have status in the United States. And so how do we talk about what Steve is talking about in his book to actually mobilize in immigrant communities along a variety of concerns, because there's really an opportunity here that a city like New York that identifies itself as progressive is still, for the last 20 years, has elected a Republican governor. And then again, when you look overall across our state, we have a complete, we're run by the right, so to speak. So I think this is a really key opportunity. I'm excited about what opportunities it provides.
Great, thank you so much. One of the things that really struck me with what you were saying was the importance of storytelling and using data to tell stories, and I think that's one of the great things that this book actually provides for us. Is, you know, it's great to hear about Steve's youth organizing days, as well as like the data that he was providing there. And I think one of the other things that really resonated with me in the book was how you know, like, communities of color are organizing. We are getting out the vote. We do have resources and tools to make this happen. But the money isn't there. The money that's controlling the mainstream progressive narrative is being funneled and controlled by white folks and white progressives that are putting that money back into white communities. And I think he refers to it as the white swing voters. So I think that was really, it was interesting to see that put into the context of this book. We wanted to open it up now to audience questions, but I'm not quite sure if we have any just yet. And if not, I have some other questions to ask.
Can I just say one thing quick, Taz, yeah, on the stories front, that one of the most surprising facts to me that I came across was not appreciating that 74% of Asian American adults are foreign born, which is like a startling fact if you don't know much about the community. I remember telling that to Roland Martin when I was on his radio show a few weeks ago. And what's important about that is that for Asian Americans, I think, to then tell that story then starts to implicate U.S. history in ways that people don't often think about, right? There's just all these assumptions that, you know, the country has been perfectly, you know, fair to every single group, et cetera, et cetera. But the 1790 immigration law saying that the definition of a citizen is a free white person was the governing law of this country basically until the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And so there was a whites-only sign explicitly around entry into the country. So I think there's a way to really start to reframe the immigration conversation by people telling their stories, particularly people from the Asian American community. And so I wanted to put that out there. In general, one thing to maybe think about it too is that there's actually a piece I commend to people today on BuzzFeed. This woman, Sarah Matthew, who's actually one of our media consultants for this book rollout. And it's a very poignant piece about coming to America at 16 years of age. She was an Indian immigrant, lived different parts of the world, just what that was like, making it very humanizing, which I think was part of how the LGBT movement was able to advance their struggle around marriage equality is by telling those personal stories and humanizing the issue is, I think, will be a significant contribution to the whole debate about immigration reform.
Yeah, one thing I'll just add, if I may, and I have about 5 minutes, Taz, before I need to step off, so apologies in advance. But specifically on immigration, immigration has gotten so racialized as Latino only, and specifically Mexican migration, and it's totally ignoring the realities on the ground. And usually I'm so good at data, and I should have prepped in advance on this, but a very significant chunk of the black population in New York is immigrant, right, of immigrant origin. We know that Asian Americans as a racial group are the most heavily immigrant group, reflecting the kind of exclusionary laws that Steve talks about and other laws as well. And so I think we need to not only hold political institutions accountable, but also media institutions accountable, because they have people who do research. They should know better. They don't have to just reflect the rhetoric of political leadership that might be excused for not knowing some of these things, right? So I think that it's the storytelling is not just what we do, but to hold media institutions accountable for their lack of accuracy, lack of representation in the kind of news stories that they put out.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things that I have kept seeing coming up in this book is that how Steve kept using media as a reference to tie his narrative together, and I thought it was really interesting because so much of it was based around the implicit bias that is embedded in politics, and how that implicit bias really revolves around how media is marketing to us as voters and as citizens. So I thought that was interesting because at the essence, yes, we do need to hold media accountable if we want to correct for these mistakes.
Can I ask a question of Stephanie? I'm curious what your experience was like running for office as an Asian American woman in a majority white state, like what those dynamics were like in terms of advice you had gotten or issues you had to mute or not mute in terms of your own identity, relationship to your community. If you could talk about that, I'd be very curious about that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. So Michigan is definitely a predominantly white state, although it's becoming more diverse every, with every census that comes out. Growing Asian American population, growing Latino population, and so I'm right now there are 3 Asian Americans in the state legislature, and none of us represent districts with large Asian American populations. So it's interesting because I do think that I think that's kind of like a positive sign that you can cross those boundaries, and especially with my district being mostly African American actually, and a pretty big Latino population as well. In my 6-month process of deciding whether or not I even wanted to run after I was initially approached and about my predecessor was trying to encourage me to run. It was mostly I had a lot more in my head that I thought race was going to be a big factor than it ended up not being a huge factor, because I think ultimately what it comes down to, at least in districts like mine, is that people just want someone who's going to work hard and shares their values. And I really thought that in a predominantly black district that I would have greater challenges actually. But it really didn't turn out that way. I mean, I won a 7-way primary by a really solid margin. And I mean, a lot of that's because I worked really hard, but I mean, some of it is also because I think that, at least in this district, people, because of the issues that because everything that I've worked on is social justice oriented and civil rights oriented, and I think people saw that, and people also saw that I was going to work really hard, and then that all sort of surpassed, whatever racial barriers there might have been, especially because in a state rep race in Michigan anyway, I personally knocked on every primary voter's door twice, and so once you meet someone and have that connection, then I think that, I mean, it would be a lot harder. It's a lot harder for someone to like have some sort of preconceived notion about what an Asian American candidate would or wouldn't be able to do for them if you haven't met them. But once, you know, I think after folks met me, like a lot of that just sort of like didn't become an issue. So, but I do think like obviously if I was running for a bigger bigger district and I wouldn't be able to talk to every single voter or like at least try to make contact with them, it probably would have been a different story and maybe my race would have been a bigger factor because I wouldn't have been able to have that level of personal interaction.
That's impressive. We have a question that came through for Karthick. The vote for people of color are generally Democrats and the elder people vote for Republicans. So what about the intersection of older people who are of color?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think it's again the way that media frame these kind of questions is important because they'll talk about the senior vote or they'll talk about the female vote, but don't look at the intersection of race with those categories, right? So if you look at for example, I'll just give an example of gender before going to elders. So there's this notion that Democrats like Obama won the female vote. So Obama won the female vote, but he did not win white females, right? He actually lost the white female vote, but he won the vote among women of color. And if you don't have that as part of your analysis, you might lead to the mistaken conclusion, especially when they talk about the women's vote, they'll show white female subjects, right? So there's actually an inaccuracy there in terms of thinking about the women's vote. And similarly with the seniors vote. If you think of seniors as white seniors, yes, they're voting more conservative or more Republican. But if you look at seniors of color, including Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Latinos, and African Americans, they vote predominantly for the Democratic Party, for Democratic candidates, in favor of various progressive issues. So it is absolutely important to break down what we think in terms of the youth vote, in terms of the senior vote, in terms of the female vote.
I'd also like to just jump in on that. I think you're absolutely right with that one. And then also that somehow that communities of color are not savvy with how we vote, right? That we simply vote in a racialized bloc or we vote in an economic bloc when actually we're looking at all of those intersections. And that I think the work that Steve is doing is also really informative, instructive for how if we're living in communities or people who are not racially identified with the community, what are the organizing tools that they need to be using and what are the lenses and the platforms they need to run on that actually can procure votes from folks of the voting bloc of people of color, that we simply don't vote just because black people just don't vote for black people. If that were the case, we'd have a whole host of candidates that were not well representing our interest in office. So I think, to your point, that we really have to look at the intersections and also really look at the things that are important to communities of color specifically.
Monica, can I ask you a question in terms of the de Blasio mayoral race? I don't know if you were you there during that time?
Yes, definitely.
So that was a very interesting situation where you have a white man married to a black woman with a son with like the best afro since Michael Jackson. How did all those things play themselves out in terms of and he took good stands on some issues. What enabled him to get support among the communities of color?
It was quite frankly his platform. So as we were experiencing him going to town halls, hearing him speak, whether it was on radio stations or watching him on TV, presenting what was a very familiar New York-based platform around how New Yorkers identify what New York should be, and then also looking to bring back services for those who have been most marginalized. And so when he was running, it was the platform, and then he felt recognizable, right? So that the construction of his family, like the literal demographics of his family, were familiar. The literal neighborhood that he lived in was familiar. So there was a tremendous familiarity around what it means to have a progressive New York City that rang true for him. We know once in office, things play out in different ways for different reasons, and that's for another conversation. But and he did the work, right? And so when Stephanie talked about coming into communities and actually connecting with communities, he already had a presence. His wife also has a presence, and so it was not foreign or unfamiliar to see him or to experience him in community besides going to Black churches on Sunday or doing the typical things that sometimes politicians can do.
Yeah, and I think that's an important example. One of the questions I'm getting a lot as I'm doing different media interviews is like, well, Obama was a singular figure, and so people came out for him, but they won't come out again, as if it were just about the color of his skin. And so I think de Blasio's an interesting example around you can actually mobilize through having a platform that speaks to the different communities.
Great. Monica, I wanted to have one more follow-up questions for you. And of course, for anyone that's watching us right now, if you have questions, please ask it in the Q&A form on Google Hangout, or you can ask us on Twitter with the hashtag Brown is the New White. I wanted to ask you, Monica, about Black Lives Matter and how I remember being at Netroots Nation this summer when Black Lives Matter activists stormed the stage when Bernie Sanders was on stage. And it seems that the movement has really pushed Black Lives Matter into the forefront of having the candidates talk about it. So I wanted to ask you about how you think Black Lives Matter shaped the race this year, and maybe some lessons that the Asian American community can learn from it, and ways that as a movement we can all work together.
Thanks. That's a great question. So I think I'm certain that we have been shaping the conversation on so many levels, on the national level as well as the state level. It was extremely profound to have members of our community actually disrupt what is supposed to be the center of progressive politics and shaping an agenda. And so it was, again, very empowering for that to happen. And then the way we've seen this play out is not just from direct action, right? So there's the direct action protest that people know, but we're also organizing day in and day out and addressing public officials, right? And so that when Tia Oso and Patrisse Cullors can actually stand out at Netroots Nation, there are hundreds of us across the country who are organizing in regional contexts so that there is support for what it is that they're saying. Particularly in New York City, we had a campaign called Safety Beyond Policing. And so some of the lessons learned is how do we build a platform for what it is that we want, so that when we are doing the direct action, the public protests, that we actually have something that we want to present, which I know is not new to anybody on this phone on this call that is doing organizing. But we actually created a platform that spoke directly to what were the concerns that Black people were facing in New York City. I believe they're the same across the country, and then creating a list of demands and actually designing the city that we would like to design. And so that went up actually for city council, and we did it a coalition-based, right? And so one of the profound things about Black Lives Matter is that people know that it is a leaderless movement, but it is leaderful, right? And so we're using the existing work of people who have been organizing around this for more than 20 years. So that's one of the lessons I would offer. Who's already on the ground that's addressing the issues that are most concerning to our communities? And so how do we mobilize that in addition to mobilizing and politicizing the communities? And the second thing, again, as I just said, is that we need a stronger civil society. And so what is the political education around electoral politics, around the issues in community that people need to know about, quite frankly. They're connected to the conditions of their situation, but when we put a frame around it, we find that people respond within that. And lastly, I would say is just the courage, right? Just making a decision for ourselves as a community that the conditions under which we're living far outweigh the risk it takes to actually hold political officials accountable. And so that's how we've been holding it. We don't necessarily endorse any political candidate, but we do create the conversation within our communities, that there should be a platform for which people feel like they can engage, and then communities can make their own choices, but they at least have to have something that is going to be accountable to them. We lost your sound.
Oh yeah, Taz can't hear you.
Here we go. Sorry. Do we have any other questions? Gonna go check on Twitter. In the meantime, I'll have a question for you, Steve. I have a lot of questions for you, actually. I was thumbing through. I was just thinking about like where we are in the primary cycle right now, and how we just finished the New Hampshire primary, and I was reading the section this morning where you talked about where Obama and Hillary were going through their primary season, and how the people of color vote made an influence in that primary cycle. And I was wondering how, just, what were your thoughts on this primary cycle? Do you think that the lessons have been learned from the previous, the 2008 primary cycle for the progressives, and just what are your thoughts on the primaries this time around when it comes to the new American majority?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, really, on both sides of the spectrum, right? In that, and we'll see that on the Democratic side, we haven't yet seen them have to deal with voters of color. I mean, it's actually kind of fascinating how much time, energy, attention, and money gets focused in on a very small, it's really, frankly, 400,000 white people, basically. This is what the entire election has focused in on so far. And so there's all this, people say, oh, these, Bernie's running well with this sector, and Hillary's running badly with that sector, but we don't really know yet. And so we're only, in a lot of ways, I feel like the preliminaries are over, and the campaign is just beginning now. And so that's what we're going to be seeing in terms of moving to Nevada with more Latinos, and more South Carolina with more African Americans. And we'll see. I think the candidates have, the Democratic candidates have improved their vocabulary, and that's been interesting to see in terms of how they responded to the Black Lives Matter protest, and that they can talk about the words Black Lives Matter, they can talk about institutional racism, and so that's all to the good. But now we're going to see behavior and actions behind those words. There's been discussion, I know there's discussion around some efforts around trying to develop capacity to actually run people for district attorney from our communities. And so these two Democratic campaigns have $200 million between them. Are they going to move some money into that kind of an effort? Is one of the things that I think I'm going to be looking at. Can we get more district attorneys who are accountable to the community and less who are only accountable to the police? And then a big question I'm going to have is what's going to be happen with, are we going to, I'm now saying, are we going to desegregate the vice president's office? We've never had a vice president of color. So can we actually put, they're going to need to put forward somebody of color to inspire and galvanize. And then on the Republican side, it's just fascinating because in some ways they're moving more towards they were moving towards embracing people of color. They did this autopsy after they lost in 2012, and they had a lot of knowledge, culturally competent knowledge around what they needed to do to engage people of color to succeed in a general election. But then along came Trump, who doubled down on nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment, shot to the top, and has pushed the whole race to the right over there. So it's going to be fascinating how they resolve that. So this is a very seminal moment. That's why I feel it's so urgent, is that we really are literally going to go forward or backwards. And that's why I want to make sure that the progressive movement and leaders understand that we have the numbers because of the work of the civil rights movement. We have to double down on that and not just think that that was a one-off and start going back to chasing the white swing voters.
Thank you for that. Do you, I mean, like, to kind of follow up on that, what do you think needs to be done by the parties?
Well, I do think one of the things that we are going to be calling for is this issue on the vice presidency. I think both as a tactical matter as well as just as a substantive piece is that are we going to take down the whites only sign on the vice president's office? And so the the movement and activists can demand that, and I think they can demand it on both sides of the aisle. Probably more likely in some ways that'll actually happen on the Republican side. They've got a broader field of people of color who are running over there, but there's got to be an insistence that the full breadth of the ticket reflect the country and speak to the full diversity of the country. People of color tend to be younger in terms of more of the population makeup. So that's got to be an insistent demand. I mean, there's only reason that they've chosen who they've chosen on the vice presidential side is because who they thought the electorate would tolerate. But the electorate has changed now. So I think if there's more of a movement from the grassroots up, that we can push them on those issues.
Great, thank you for that. I think we only have Steve for a few more minutes, so maybe we could do some. Maybe Steve, you can close us out first, and then I'll go to Monica and Stephanie for their closing statements.
Great. Thanks so much, and thanks for having me on the call. And I'm really glad. This is really why I wrote the book, and I'm really glad to be in connection and partnership, and that I think this is only going to be meaningful to the extent that we are all doing our piece. And so I've tried to provide a tool, but I'm very excited to be partnering with people. And I think we have great opportunity in general, but I want to, I think we all feel this, but I think there's great urgency that when we have such an election where people are talking about rounding up all 11 million Mexican immigrants who don't have the right paperwork and banning all Muslims from coming into the country, and that's the conversation that we're having, this is the period of great urgency. Yeah. Fortunately, we have the numbers to prevail against it, but the progressive movement does not necessarily fully grasp that. So I'm trying to engage in a call to action, sometimes refer to myself as Black Paul Revere, to really get people's attention to focus on these issues, invest large amounts of money in these communities of color, because that's the right way to win, and the stakes are so high at this point in time. So I do have to jump to get on another call, but I want to thank you guys for having me on this. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for partaking, and thanks for writing this book and putting to print so much of our conversations in the movement.
Great, thank you.
Let's go to Stephanie.
Well, thank you so much to 18 Million Rising for inviting me to be part of this. This was fun. This was really great, and I look forward to digging into the book, and also I'm just so curious to see, like, it would be awesome to do this in, after November, to see, like, did anyone listen to what has happened since, and how did it play out, or did any of it play out? I mean, I'm hopeful. I'm always optimistic. So, but this is great. Really, really appreciate the conversation. And, I hope that other folks, especially other elected officials, sort of take note about the important lessons from this, and really interweave some of the important ideas into what we're doing.
Great. And Monica?
Yeah, I'm also really excited about this conversation, and particularly think that there's a lot of space for organizing and relationship building and solidarity between Black and Asian American API communities, and how might we mobilize and really leverage the collective power that we have, given that so many of our interests are similar. So this conversation has just reignited that thing that I've been thinking about how do we mass mobilize on a number of levels. And I'm looking to this particular book to help address the disillusionment. Part of what the challenge is, again, is that we have a current administration that has been less progressive than I think we cast the aspirations onto President Obama. And so there's an ideal that he represents, there's a tremendous success and some part of the progressive agenda that was happened, and yet the mass deportation policies, the regressive, repressive deportation policies are deeply disturbing. And then just how imperialism shows up around the world through the United States, right? And people are watching that, right? And so you're talking about an engaged community. So how do we collectively mobilize around that, and how do we use these stories, our experiences, to actually re-engage people who actually have the power to change elections?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel there was a point in the book where Steve talks about how after President Obama was elected, how even after elected, the cabinet was still trying to woo the white swing voters, and I thought that was really fascinating because it's the how the country is run is so centered around whiteness that even with you know a man of color in office, they were still trying to woo white folks, which was clear in the immigration conversation.
And I'll just add this really quick thing, I know we're probably at time, is that there are ways in which, if I think about going back to de Blasio, Mayor de Blasio as an example, there are ways in which part of what made him popular is that he could actually speak to race because he had white privilege that provided that banner, that buffer rather, to allow him to speak about mass incarceration and homelessness in communities of color and racial profiling. That is, and I think about this for Stephanie and others, other folks of color who possibly may be running in white communities, like where's the threshold for what we can actually talk about when we're in that first wave of folks that are running for office or that are holding any kind of elected position? Do we have the same leverage to do the same work? And so that also requires more organizing amongst us as allies.
Yes, absolutely. It was great to hear Stephanie talk about her experience running. Do we have any other questions? I don't think, if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to close us out. I believe this conversation is going to be available online, so if people want to share it, you can go ahead and share it. Thank you to our panelists. Karthick had to leave a little bit earlier. Steve left to jump on to a press call. Thank you, Monica, for coming in around the world from Johannesburg. Stephanie from the cold Michigan. And thank you to PowerPack for co-sponsoring this. We also do have, we will have links available to the book. I'm not quite sure. We were having we would get a percentage of the revenue if you use the link, but I don't think that's active anymore. So, but we will be sharing a link to purchase the book on all of our social media, 18 Million Rising on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook. You can follow us in all of those spaces. We look forward to having more of these conversations as we go deeper into the elections. So keep following us. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to the panelists for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
See everyone online.